We hear it all the time, right? Crime is on the rise. But today,
Yeah.
we're going deeper, like beyond just those headlines. We're going to like try to figure out who is actually behind all these violent crimes and, who are the victims. So that's what we're diving into today. We're using 5 years of data straight from the source, the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. It covers like over 18,000 law enforcement agencies all across the U.S. So it's a pretty comprehensive picture, And the findings are way more complicated than you might think. For example, get this. While men are more likely to be committing these acts, victimization. It's almost evenly split between genders. Pretty interesting, right?
It really does challenge that common perception.
Yeah.
That violence is a predominantly male problem, both in terms of who's doing it and who's on the receiving end.
Okay.
In the data skies we take our flight. Trends and numbers come to life. Colors and charts, they dance and play. Showing truth in a visual way. In GenderDecoded we uncover truths and stories like no other. In the data waves we find the secret maps of humankind.
Thing that really jumped out at me when I was looking at this data is that almost 70% of those who commit these violent crimes are men.
It's a statistic that consistently shows up in crime data all over the world, too. Not just here.
Wow. That's a pretty big majority. Makes you wonder why, right? But then here's the thing that I found even more interesting. Like when we look at the victims of violent crime, the numbers are almost evenly split between men and women.
Yeah, it's not quite what you'd expect at first glance, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, if men are the ones committing most of the violence, why aren't they also the primary victims?
Right. It's a good question.
So how do we even begin to explain that?
I think to get to the bottom of it, we really have to dig into the different types of violence and who's involved.
Okay, so let's start with that first statistic that nearly 70% of violent offenders are male. That's, 69.28% to be exact, compared to just 15.83% who are female.
Yeah, it's a huge gap.
So big, right?
And like I said, this pattern holds true globally. Men are consistently the majority when it comes to those committing violent acts.
So I've heard people say, oh, it's just biology, men are more aggressive. But I feel like it has to be more complicated than that.
Oh, for sure. It's way more nuanced than that. Biology does play a role, sure. I mean, things like testosterone levels and so on, they definitely factor into aggression. But it's not like a simple cause and effect thing.
Right.
You can't just say men have testosterone, therefore they're all going to be violent. It's not like that at all.
Right. It's like saying women have estrogen, and so they're all going to cry at commercials or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's just way too simplistic to reduce it down to hormones.
Okay, so if it's not just about biology, what else is going on? I mean, why is this trend so consistent across different cultures?
Well, researchers have been looking into this for decades, and honestly, there's no single answer. But what we do know is that it's a complex mix of things. It's biology, but also the social messages that boys are given from a very young age.
Oh, interesting.
The cultural norms, all of those things sort of come together and shape how men view aggression and conflict.
So you're saying it's like how society expects men to behave.
Yeah, like think about all those classic stereotypes. Boys will be boys. Or, man up, don't be a wimp.
I've heard all those.
Right. These messages, they tell boys that they're supposed to be tough and assertive, that they shouldn't back down from a fight, that showing any kind of vulnerability is a weakness.
So these messages, they could actually be contributing to that statistic we were talking about, that 70%.
Absolutely. It's definitely part of the puzzle.
That's really fascinating. Okay, but now let's flip the script a little and talk about the victims.
Yeah.
We know that men make up the vast majority of the offenders, but then both men and women are almost equally likely to be the victims. So how do we explain that?
Well, it comes down to the different types of violence that men and women experience. Like, they're not all the same.
I see. So it's not just the overall numbers, but the context of the violence, right?
Exactly. It's really important to look at the specifics. For instance, men are much more likely to be the victims of, what we might call public violence. Things like assaults, fights that happen in bars or on the streets.
So kind of like a brawl breaking out in a bar.
Exactly. And statistically, the people involved in those situations are much more likely to be men.
Both the perpetrators and the victims.
Yep, that's right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if men are disproportionately represented in those public displays of violence, where are women more likely to be victims?
Unfortunately, women are much more likely to be the victims of violence that happens, behind closed doors. Things like domestic violence, sexual assault, violence that happens within relationships.
Right, and that often goes unreported, right?
Sadly, yes. That's often the case.
It's just heartbreaking to think about how widespread these issues really are, even though we don't always see them.
Absolutely. It's a serious problem, and it often ties back to those deep-rooted cultural factors and power imbalances we were talking about before.
So before we move on, I want to go back to something you said earlier about men and women being almost equally likely to be victims overall.
Sure.
The data we're looking at, it does have some limitations, right? I mean, there are categories for unknown or not specified when it comes to the gender of both the offender and the victim. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to bring that up. Those categories are really important to acknowledge because they highlight some of the challenges we have when it comes to collecting accurate crime data.
What do you mean?
Well, sometimes the gender of the offender or the victim might genuinely be unknown. Maybe there were no witnesses or the information wasn't recorded properly.
Okay.
And sometimes, especially with crimes like sexual assault or domestic violence, those very sensitive situations, the victims might not feel comfortable disclosing certain details.
Right. That makes sense.
So those unknown and not specified categories, they remind us that the data, it doesn't always tell the whole story.
So we need to be careful about drawing too many conclusions from those overall numbers.
Exactly. It's important to recognize the limitations of the data and to keep pushing for better ways to collect that information.
Okay, so we've talked about those big statistics, about the gender disparity when it comes to who commits violent crimes, the fact that men and women are almost equally represented as victims, and the different types of violence each gender experiences. But what does all of this really tell us about society?
That's a great question, and I think it highlights how deeply intertwined gender and crime really are.
It's not just about individual acts of violence. It's about something much bigger.
Yeah, it's about those underlying societal patterns and expectations. It's about how we raise boys and girls, the messages we send about what it means to be a man or a woman.
It's about our culture as a whole.
Exactly.
So if we want to create real, lasting change, we need to look beyond just the numbers, right?
Absolutely. We have to tackle those root causes of violence, and that means addressing those deep-seated social and cultural factors that we've been talking about.
All right, so where do we even start? I mean, what can we actually do to address this massive, complex problem?
Well, I think the first step is to recognize that there is no quick fix. It's going to require a multifaceted approach, and it's going to take time.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some of those approaches then?
Well, we'll get into that in our next part. Well, one thing we need to keep in mind is that, victimization, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right.
Different types of violence call for different types of solutions, and we really need to think about all those other factors too, socioeconomic status, what's going on in different communities, the dynamics of relationships.
You're saying we need to be looking at the whole picture, not just like focusing in on one specific aspect of this thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads us to policy solutions. If we want to really get to those root causes of violence, we need to take approaches that are gender sensitive.
So I guess what you're saying is that it's not helpful to just point the finger at men and say, like men are the problem.
Right.
It's more about how do we equip men with the tools they need, to handle conflict better and, and deal with their emotions in healthy ways.
Yeah, exactly. We need to change the way we think about strength and masculinity. It shouldn't be about violence and domination.
Right.
No.
Yeah. And for women, I guess it's about making sure there are resources, support systems for those who've experienced domestic violence or sexual assault.
Right. Exactly.
It's like we're supporting those who are already victims while we're also trying to prevent future violence by changing some of the, the social and cultural things that are contributing to it.
Exactly. That's the idea.
But, we talked earlier about those limitations in the data, those unknown and not specified categories. And, well, those really make it hard to get the full picture, right? Especially when it comes to things like domestic violence.
Yeah, absolutely. If we don't even really know how big the problem is, it makes it much harder to come up with solutions that actually work,
So we need to figure out better ways to collect data.
Right. But that's only one part of it. We've got to change the culture, too.
Yeah, but how? That's a huge undertaking.
I know, but it's absolutely necessary. If we really want to stop the glorification of violence and toxic masculinity, we need to start promoting something different, something better. We need to encourage people to take responsibility for creating a safer society together.
So it's not just about changing individual behavior then. It's like we need a collective shift in the way we think about these issues.
Yeah. Think about campaigns promoting healthy relationships, educational programs that teach young people conflict resolution and, respectful communication.
That sounds like a huge amount of work.
It is. But it's worth it. We can't keep putting Band-Aids on this problem,
Yeah, I love that you mentioned shared responsibility. It's not just on the police or the government to fix this. We all have a part to play.
Absolutely.
So speaking of shared responsibility, what can individuals do, in their own lives to be a part of the solution?
That's a great question. I think the first thing is educate yourself. Learn about the causes of violence, what forms it takes, what resources are out there to help.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. And once you have that knowledge, you can start taking action.
Like what?
Well, there are a lot of things. You can speak up when you see something that's wrong. You can support organizations that are working to prevent violence or, that help survivors.
Oh, okay.
You could volunteer at a local shelter or a mentoring program.
So it's about being informed and then, actually getting involved.
Right. It's about being willing to step up and do something.
And it's about challenging those harmful stereotypes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you hear somebody making a sexist joke or, brushing off something that happened to a woman, you call them out.
Yeah, exactly. And encourage boys and young men to learn how to express their emotions in a healthy way, and teach them that violence isn't the answer.
So those everyday things that we might not even think about can actually make a difference.
They can. They really can. Because those bigger cultural shifts, they happen one conversation at a time,
It's like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
This all makes me think about the data we looked at about, race and socioeconomic status.
Right.
I mean, we have to be really careful about how we interpret those numbers.
Sure.
But it seems like violence really disproportionately affects those communities that are already marginalized.
Yeah, that's an important observation. While we have to be careful about drawing conclusions from the data, it is clear that things like poverty, lack of opportunity, even just being exposed to trauma, those things can really increase the risk of both becoming a victim of violence and perpetrating it.
Yeah, it's like this awful cycle.
As a vicious cycle. And it's tough to break out of.
So how do we even start to break that cycle?
Well, we need to address those underlying social and economic inequalities, right? Investing in education, job training, making sure people have access to affordable housing. These are all things that can help create communities that are safer and healthier for everyone.
So it's not just about the traditional law enforcement approach. Like, we need to be looking at solutions that address the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about investing in people, in communities, not just punishment.
Yeah, it's about creating a culture of support, making sure people feel empowered to ask for help when they need it and to intervene if they see violence happening.
Exactly. That's what we need to be working towards.
It's a big goal.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem impossible if we break it down into smaller steps.
I agree. We can do this if we all work together.
So we've covered a lot today, some really difficult truths about our society.
I have.
But we've also talked about some really amazing possibilities, for change.
I think that's important to remember. Even though this can feel like a really heavy topic, there's always hope. We can be a part of the solution.
I love that. And I love how you keep emphasizing that it's on all of us, We're all in this together. We're back. And, well, we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff, gender and violence. But I think it's been a really good conversation. Eye-opening, for sure.
It has. It's a complex issue, but talking about it, really understanding the different aspects of it, that's the first step to creating change.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things that really struck me is, how important it is to look beyond those really simple narratives we hear all the time about violence,
Like, what do you mean?
Well, it's easy to fall into that trap of saying men are the problem. But it's obviously way more complicated than that.
Oh, for sure. It's never that simple.
Right. And it's not fair to women either to just say they're always the victims,
Yeah.
Because sometimes they are the perpetrators of violence.
Absolutely.
It's really about understanding that, victimization can take so many forms and different types of violence need different solutions.
Yeah, we can't just try to apply like a one-size-fits-all approach to this problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work that way. And something else we talked about that I keep thinking about is those deep-rooted cultural norms, The ones that glorify violence and toxic masculinity.
Right, those are so hard to change.
They are.
Sure.
But, I mean, we have to try, right?
Yeah.
Because as long as we're holding on to those harmful ideas, it's going to be really hard to create a truly safe and just society.
I agree. We need to promote healthy relationships, teach people better ways to deal with conflict, and really just foster this sense of shared responsibility.
Yes. That shared responsibility thing, that's something I've been thinking about a lot since we started this whole conversation. It's not just on, like, the police or lawmakers to fix this.
Mm-hmm.
It really is on all of us to create a better world, you know?
Absolutely. Every single one of us has a role to play in this.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final question, something to think about, you know? We've talked about how important it is to shift those cultural norms, how we need to create a culture of support and accountability. But what specific actions, big or small, do you think our listeners could take in their own communities, or even just in their own lives, to help make a difference?
Well, it could be anything, really. I mean, it could be something small, like, talking to a friend about healthy masculinity, or, maybe it's something bigger like, advocating for policy changes. It doesn't have to be some grand gesture, It's more about consistently taking those steps in the right direction.
And those small steps, they add up, right? They create a ripple effect.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really incredible deep dive. We've talked about a lot of tough stuff. But I really feel like we've also uncovered some really hopeful possibilities for change. So to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Keep those conversations going. And, let's all work together to create that safer, more just world that we've been talking about.
I couldn't have said it better myself.